To prove his theory, Dr. Elias Vance was willing to do the unthinkable. He would take healthy men and, by design, make them sick. He would draw the blood, the skin, and the filth from the dying and inject it directly into his own veins. Was this the work of a madman, a monster who tortured prisoners for his own ambition? Or was it the last, desperate act of a man trying to save millions from a truth far more horrifying than any disease? The year is 1914. The steam train, a black iron beast panting clouds of grey, cuts a line through the suffocating heat of the South Carolina countryside. It moves through a landscape bleached by an oppressive sun, past depleted cotton fields and unpainted shacks that list to one side as if exhausted by the simple act of standing. This is a land of stark, quiet poverty, a place where the earth itself seems to have given up. Inside a sparse passenger car, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track is a monotonous metronome counting out the miles. Dr. Elias Vance, a man in his 40s with a sharp, intense gaze that misses nothing, sits alone. His suit is formal, a dark wool shield against the world, but it's creased and travel-worn. In his hands, he holds a report from the Public Health Service. The paper is a sea of sterile clinical language, a neat and orderly description of a disease called Pellagra, dermatitis, characterized by a bilateral erythema in a classic butterfly distribution, followed by dementia, characterized by confusion, disorientation, and delirium, and ultimately diarrhea, leading to fatal dehydration and cachexia. Vance reads the words, the tidy 3 Ds the medical establishment has settled upon: dermatitis, dementia, diarrhea. A simple, alliterative key to a complex and horrifying lock. His mind, trained in the rigors of the scientific method, appreciates the attempt at order. But then his eyes drift to the window and the order shatters. A woman stands by the tracks, her face a gaunt mask of weariness. Beside her, 2 small children, their limbs thin as reeds, their movements slow and listless. They don't wave. They just watch the train pass with empty eyes. Vance's own eyes close for a moment. The clinical detachment of the report evaporates in the face of the raw, human misery just beyond the glass. The words on the page are clean. The reality is not. The words described a disease. The window showed a curse. He was here to fight the disease, but he had a chilling premonition that the true enemy was something far larger and more deeply rooted than a microbe. The smell hits first. It is the odor of a place where hope has died, a thick, cloying miasma of sickness, sweat, and despair. Dr. Vance walks through Ward C of the State Lunatic Asylum, his professional composure a carefully constructed fortress. Beside him, the asylum's superintendent, a man whose exhaustion is etched into every line on his face, offers a weary practice tour. The ward is a gallery of living horrors. It is chaos. Men and women are crammed into a space built for half their number. Some are catatonic, staring at walls only they can see. Others rave, their voices roar from screaming at phantoms. And on so many of them, the telltale sign of Pellagra, a dark, angry rash that spreads across the nose and cheeks in the shape of a butterfly, a grotesque mockery of something beautiful. On their hands and necks, their skin is cracked and peeling, raw and red like a terrible burn. Vance's gaze is clinical, searching. He is not a man given to overt displays of emotion. He forces himself to see patterns, not people, symptoms, not suffering. He is here to solve a puzzle, not to grieve. He stops by a cot where a young woman lies. She cannot be more than 20. She stares blankly at the ceiling, her hands resting on the thin blanket. They are covered in cracked, bleeding lesions, the skin pulling away from the knuckles. She is a textbook case, a perfect specimen of the disease he has been sent to investigate. The superintendent gestures vaguely. The insanity of the unclean, they call it, comes on like a thief in the night. First the skin, then the mind. We believe it's an infectious agent, of course, Something in the dust, perhaps, or borne by insects, highly contagious. Vance doesn't respond. He simply watches the woman's chest rise and fall in shallow breaths. The establishment has a story, a superstitious, convenient narrative of a plague that rises from the filth of the poor. It is neat. It is simple. It explains away the suffering as a consequence of being unclean. But Vance's mind, a machine built on logic and observation, rebels against simplicity. He sees the effect, brutal and undeniable. The cause, however, remained a ghost. An hour later, the contrast is dizzying. The asylum staff mess hall is an oasis of order and calm. It is clean. The air smells of roasted meat and fresh bread. Here, the doctors and nurses, the very people who walk the infected wards every day, are vibrant and healthy. Vance sits with the superintendent, a plate of beef, greens, and a glass of milk in front of him. He is picking at the food, his mind elsewhere. He looks at the plates of the nurses around him, the same wholesome fare. Then he asks a question, his tone deliberately casual. "How many of your staff have contracted pellagra, Superintendent?" The man scoffs, taking a hearty bite of his meal. "None, not a single one. We're careful. We maintain the strictest hygiene. We understand the risks of contagion." The word hangs in the air. Contagion. Vance's gaze becomes distant. He isn't seeing the mess hall anymore. He is seeing the chipped bowls in Ward C, filled with the daily ration for the patients. A greasy portion of cornmeal mush, a drizzle of molasses, a small piece of fatback. A meal of the 3 M's. Meat, what little there was. Meal and molasses. Then he looks at his own plate. Meat, milk, vegetables. In that instant, a connection is made. An idea, sharp and brilliant and utterly paradigm-shattering, clicks into place in his mind. It is an observation so simple, so fundamental, that it has been completely overlooked. If pellagra were contagious, a germ spreading through the air or by touch, its first victims should be the nurses and orderlies. They work in the heart of it, breathing the same air, touching the same patients, yet they remain untouched. The disease does not cross the invisible line between patient and staff, but something else does. Food. The superintendent continues to talk, his voice fading into a dull drone. Dr. Vance is no longer listening. He's staring at his plate, but what he sees is a map, a clue that could unravel the entire mystery. Night has fallen. In a cramped, borrowed office, lit by a single bare bulb, Dr. Elias Vance works. The sounds of the asylum are muffled, a distant chorus of the damned. He isn't writing a report, he is sketching, the graphite of his pencil scratching against the paper with a fierce intensity. He has drawn 2 columns down the center of a page. At the top of the left column, he writes, "Patient diet." Underneath, he lists the grim staples, cornmeal, molasses, fatback. At the top of the right column, he writes, "Staff diet." Under that, the list is starkly different. Meat, milk, eggs, vegetables. He stares at the 2 lists for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he draws a heavy line from the patient's list to a single, stark word, pellagra. He draws another line, this one from the staff's list, to an equally simple word, healthy. He leans back in his chair, the wood creaking in the silence. The look on his face is not one of triumph. There is no joy in this discovery, no eureka moment of scientific ecstasy. There is only a dawning, grim certainty. He knows what the simple chart implies. The monster they are hunting, the phantom germ that has terrified the nation, is not a microbe. It doesn't fly on dust motes or hide in the bite of a fly. The monster is in the menu. It's not an infection. It is poverty served up in a bowl 3 times a day. He knows, with a certainty that settles in his bones like a block of ice, that this truth will not be celebrated. It will be fought. It is an indictment not of a germ, but of a society. And to prove it, he will have to go to war with the very men who sent him here. The fight has just begun. The journey to Washington, D.C. was one of grim purpose. Dr. Elias Vance, armed with his meticulously drawn charts and the unshakable certainty of his own observations, was ready to present his case. He believed in the system. He believed that facts, presented logically, were the currency of science, and that his peers, men of reason, would surely recognize their value. He was about to learn how naive that belief was. The room was designed to intimidate. Grand, heavy, and paneled in dark, gleaming wood, the chamber of the Public Health Commission felt less like a place of science and more like a courtroom. Vance stood alone before a long table, facing a panel of stern, older doctors whose faces were etched with the unimpeachable authority of their positions. At the center sat Dr. Alistair Finch. He was in his 60s, with a mane of white hair and an imperious posture that seemed carved from granite. He was the personification of the medical establishment, a man for whom the prevailing germ theory was not a theory at all, but an article of faith. Vance laid out his argument with a passion tempered by logic. He pointed to his charts, showing the map of the asylum, the dietary lists, the stark, undeniable correlation. "The data is conclusive," Vance argued, his voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "The variable that determines the outcome, sickness or health, is not hygiene. It is not proximity to the afflicted. It is, in every observable case, the patient's diet." Finch listened with an expression of barely concealed condescension, his fingertips steepled before him. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment after Vance had finished, making him feel small, like a student before a master. "A dietary imbalance, Doctor." Finch's voice was smooth, but laced with ridicule. "We are in the midst of a plague that is leveling the American South. It is turning thousands of our citizens into lunatics before it kills them. We, the leaders of this nation's public health, are on a hunt for a monstrous microscopic germ." "And you, Dr. Vance, you give us a grocery list." A low wave of chuckles rippled through the panel of doctors. The sound was like stones striking a shield. In that moment, Vance understood. He had not come here for a scientific debate. He had come to a trial of heresy, and his evidence was inadmissible because it challenged the dogma of the court. His facts were worthless here. Defeated but not broken, Vance sought another avenue. The press. If the men of science wouldn't listen, perhaps the public would. He met with Samuel Croft, a journalist for the Washington Herald, in a bustling coffee shop that smelled of roasted beans and ambition. Croft was in his 30s, with a cynical glint in his eye and a restless energy. He was writing a series on the Pellagra epidemic, and Vance hoped to provide him with the truth. Croft listened, tapping his pen on his notepad, but his interest was clearly waning. Vance explained his observations, the staff, the patients, the food. He tried to convey the logical elegance of his hypothesis. Croft finally cut him off, leaning forward with a conspiratorial air. "Look, Doctor, it's a good story for a medical journal maybe, but for my readers, they want a monster. They want a mystery plague, an invisible killer creeping into their homes. It's terrifying. It's exciting." He gestured dismissively with his pen. "So the establishment, Dr. Finch and his boys, they think it's a germ, but you think it's just bad food?" He leaned back and gave a wry smile. "That doesn't sell papers, Doctor. A plague sells papers. Poverty just makes people uncomfortable." Vance left the meeting with a profound sense of isolation. The scientific establishment had rejected him out of prejudice and dogma. The press had rejected him out of commercialism and a thirst for sensationalism. The public was being fed a story of a phantom menace, a modern superstition dressed in a lab coat, because it was more compelling than the ugly, mundane truth. If he wanted proof, he would have to get it himself. He returned south, not with the full backing of the commission, but with a pittance, a tiny, begrudgingly approved grant for a small-scale dietary study. It was meant to placate him, to send him back to the fringes where he could do no harm to the official narrative. But for Vance, it was a start. It was everything. He found his laboratory in the rundown kitchen of a forgotten orphanage on the outskirts of Spartanburg. Here, dozens of children, their bodies frail and their futures bleak, were already in the grip of Pellagra. Working alongside him was Mary Ann Poole, a local nurse in her 50s, whose pragmatism was born from having seen too much death to have any faith left in miracles or official doctrines. She watched, her arms crossed, as Vance directed the preparation of new meals, personally stirring a mixture of milk and powdered yeast, a cheap, nutrient-rich supplement he theorized could make a difference. "You think a little milk and yeast is going to save them, Doctor?" Mary Ann asked, her voice heavy with the weariness of 1,000 lost battles. There was no mockery in her tone, only a deep, abiding skepticism of any easy solution. Vance didn't look up from his work, his focus absolute. "I think," he replied, his voice low and steady, "that we have to test the hypothesis." For Mary Ann, it was a matter of saving children. For Vance, it was that and more. It was a matter of saving the truth. Weeks turned into a month. The humid summer air grew thick and heavy. In the orphanage, Vance and Mary Ann worked tirelessly, enforcing the new diet, documenting every small change, every slight improvement or setback. The only thing to do was wait and hope. Then, one quiet afternoon, the proof arrived. Vance stood in the doorway of the orphanage infirmary. The room, once filled with the moans of sick and delirious children, was now still. In the center of the room, a young girl of about 8 sat up in her cot. A month ago, she had been a ghost, lost in the fog of dementia, her face scarred by the angry butterfly rash. Now she was calm, her eyes clear and focused. In her lap, she held a piece of paper and a charcoal pencil, meticulously sketching a picture of a bird she could see through the window. The rash on her face had not vanished, but it had faded dramatically, from a raw crimson mask to a pale pink shadow. It was a ghost of a symptom, the retreating footprint of a monster that had been driven back. Mary Ann Poole stood beside Vance, her hand covering her mouth. Tears streamed freely down her face, silent testament to the miracle she was witnessing. Vance's expression was different. There were no tears. There was only a profound, bone-deep, weary relief. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The storm of emotion was all internal. His hypothesis was correct. It worked. He had his first piece of undeniable proof. The victory was small, a single flickering candle in an overwhelming darkness. But it was enough. Now he just had to make the world see its light. This time, Dr. Elias Vance returned to Washington with the weight of proof in his briefcase. The photographs were undeniable. Stark, black and white images of children, their faces once hollow, and their skin once marked by the terrible butterfly rash, now looking bright, healthy, and human again. His data was meticulous, a fortress of facts charting the steady decline of symptoms against the controlled introduction of a balanced diet. He walked back into the grand, wood-paneled chamber of the Public Health Commission, not with the hope of a petitioner, but with the confidence of a victor. He laid it all out for them. The photographs were projected onto a screen, the faces of the recovered children silencing the room. He presented his charts, his voice steady and filled with a controlled passion as he detailed the scientific rigor of his orphanage study. He concluded, his eyes fixed on Dr. Alistair Finch. The evidence is clear. Pellagra is not a communicable disease. It is a nutritional deficiency. It is quite simply a form of starvation. Finch, who had remained impassive throughout the presentation, was unmoved. He let the silence stretch, allowing Vance's triumphant conclusion to wither in the heavy air. Then, he slowly rose to his feet, his presence commanding the absolute attention of the room. He did not look at Vance. He addressed the commission, his voice a smooth, polished instrument of power. "We thank Dr. Vance for his passionate efforts." The word passionate was wielded like an insult, a suggestion of feminine emotion, not masculine reason. "What Dr. Vance has demonstrated," Finch continued, his tone condescendingly patient, "is that a better diet can improve a patient's fortitude. A stronger body naturally is better equipped to fight off infection. It may help them resist the Pellagra germ. He paused, letting the twisted logic sink in. It does not, however, prove the germ doesn't exist. His findings are compelling, certainly, but they are in the end anecdotal. Anecdotal. The word was a gunshot. It vaporized Vance's data, his photographs, his proof. Finch had not refuted his facts. He had simply absorbed them into his own narrative, twisting them into evidence for the very theory they disproved. Vance stood there, stunned into absolute silence. He had come armed for a battle of science, bringing facts and evidence as his weapons. He had not realized he was walking into a war of politics, where truth was merely a matter of interpretation. The hotel room was a wreckage of despair. Discarded papers, charts covered in useless data, littered the floor. A half-eaten dinner sat cold on a tray by the door. Dr. Vance stood at the window, staring out at the distant, indifferent lights of Washington, D.C., a glass of whiskey sweating in his hand. He had not touched the drink. He just held it, the cold glass a small, solid anchor in a world that had dissolved into smoke. Finch's voice replayed in his head, a relentless echo. Anecdotal. The word was a brand, searing itself into his mind. He had followed the rules. He had adhered to the scientific method: observation, hypothesis, experimentation, result, and it had all amounted to nothing. He had been dismissed, not with competing data, but with a rhetorical trick, a condescending pat on the head. On the table, an unopened letter from his wife sat waiting. He had carried it with him for 2 days. He picked it up, his thumb tracing the familiar curves of her handwriting. He couldn't bring himself to open it. What would he write back? "My dear, the facts don't matter." He put the letter down. He saw his own reflection in the dark window glass. A tired, defeated man in a rumpled suit. A man who had tried to fight a dragon with a slide rule. He had believed that evidence was power. He now understood that power was the only evidence that mattered. A crushing sense of failure washed over him. A crisis of faith not in God, but in the very methods that had defined his life. The darkness of the hotel room eventually gave way to the thin, grey light of dawn. Vance had not slept. He sat in a chair, the untouched whiskey still on the table beside him, his mind a maelstrom of failure and fury. And then, out of the wreckage, an idea began to form. It was not a gentle, scholarly hypothesis. It was a shard of glass. It was desperate. It was dangerous. In the world of established medicine, it was deeply unethical, and it was brilliant. A new energy seized him, a manic clarity born from the ashes of his despair. He lunged for his notebook and a pencil, his movements no longer weary, but sharp and frantic. He began to sketch, his handwriting a furious scrawl across the page. He wasn't just planning an experiment, he was designing a weapon. 2 of them. First, a definitive controlled study. He would not simply cure Pellagra, he would create it. He would take healthy men and, through a restricted diet, induce the disease from scratch. The location, a prison farm. The subjects, convicts. The moral cost, enormous. Second, he would destroy the germ theory once and for all. He would prove on his own body that Pellagra was not contagious. He would expose himself and other volunteers to the blood, the filth, the very essence of the disease. A direct, visceral, and theatrical refutation. At the top of a fresh page, he wrote a heading that made his own hand tremble. Human Transmission Studies. Underneath it, he began a list of volunteers. The first name he wrote was his own, Dr. Elias Vance. This was his new path. He was no longer just a pragmatist, a man of careful observation. To defeat a dogma, he would have to become an obsessive, a zealot for the truth, pushing the boundaries of science and ethics to their absolute limit. The air at Rankin Prison Farm in Mississippi was thick, heavy, and still. It was a place of last chances and long years. Dr. Vance stood before a group of 12 men, their faces hard, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. They wore the drab, shapeless uniforms of the state, their identities stripped away, leaving only their sentences. Vance did not soften his pitch. He did not hide the truth in euphemisms. He stood before them, a man in a formal suit looking utterly out of place in the dirt and dust, and made his offer. "Your sentences are long," he began, his voice clear and steady. "I am here on behalf of the United States government to offer 11 of you a full and immediate pardon." The 12th man was already a volunteer, a prisoner with a life sentence who had nothing to lose. A murmur went through the men. A pardon was a fantasy, a myth. "In exchange," Vance continued, "you will agree to participate in a dietary study that will last several months. You will be divided into 2 groups. One group will receive a balanced diet. The other group will not." He looked each man in the eye. "I will not lie to you. The purpose of this experiment is to see if a restricted diet can cause a disease called Pellagra. Those in the second group will be fed a diet of cornmeal, molasses, and fatback. It is possible you will become sick, very sick." He let the words hang in the oppressive heat. He was offering them their freedom, but the price might be their health. He was asking them to risk a terrible illness for a chance to walk out of the gates. It was a monstrous calculation. The prisoners looked at each other, silent conversations passing between them. They were poor men, forgotten men. Society had already condemned them. Now, a man from that same society was offering them a dangerous, almost insane bargain. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, one man, tall and wiry, stepped forward. "I'm in," he said, his voice raspy. Another followed, and then another. One by one they agreed, crossing a threshold with him. Vance had his subjects. He had crossed his own line. The experiment, with all its moral ambiguity and terrifying potential, had begun. The months at Rankin Prison Farm passed like a slow fever dream. The Mississippi sun beat down on the cotton fields, and inside the prison infirmary, Dr. Elias Vance's grim hypothesis blossomed into horrifying reality. The men in the control group, who received a balanced diet of fresh meat, vegetables, and milk, remained robust and healthy, their sentences lightened by good food and the promise of freedom. But the men in the experimental group, the ones fed the classic southern diet of the poor, cornmeal, molasses, and rancid fatback, began to fade. One of them, a man named Harris, now lay on a cot, his body weak, his mind lost in a delirious fog. And on his face, like a death sentence written in skin, the faint but unmistakable outline of the butterfly rash was beginning to form. Vance examined him, his touch professionally gentle, but his face was a mask of cold, clinical observation. He checked the man's pulse, made a note of the skin's texture, and charted the rising fever. He was a scientist collecting data from a successful experiment. Mary Ann Poole, who had insisted on volunteering to assist, stood by the foot of the bed, her face a portrait of concern. She had seen this 1,000 times in the asylums and orphanages, but to see it inflicted, to watch it being created by design, was another matter entirely. "Elias," she said, her voice a soft, pleading whisper, "you're proving it. I see that. But look at him. Look at what it costs." Vance did not look at her. He couldn't afford to. To feel the weight of his own actions in that moment would be to break. Instead, he turned away from the sick man and made a neat, precise entry in his logbook. Subject C. Early-stage dermatitis consistent with Pellagra diagnosis. Delirium present. He was becoming the monster he needed to be to win. The scientific success felt like a profound moral failure, and in the quiet of the infirmary, he could feel the full, crushing weight of it. While the prison experiment demonstrated how Pellagra could be created, Vance knew he still had to demolish the core of Finch's argument, the phantom germ. He had to prove, in a way that no one could refute or twist, that the disease was not contagious. For this, there was only one path left. His makeshift lab was a small sanitized room, lit by a single, harsh bare bulb that threw long dancing shadows on the walls. This was the night of the first Filth party. The air was thick with tension and the smell of antiseptic. A small, loyal band had gathered. Mary Ann was there, her face grim but resolved. Vance's own wife, Eleanor, stood beside him, her presence a silent testament of faith in her husband. And in the corner, holding a camera with a flash gun, was Samuel Croft, the journalist. The cynical seeker of sensationalism was gone, replaced by a somber convert, a man who had seen the truth in the orphanage and now felt compelled to document this final, desperate act of science. On a small table sat a petri dish. Inside was a grotesque slurry, a mixture of blood, saliva, and skin scrapings taken from the sickest Pellagra patients. Vance drew the substance into a syringe. The needle glinted under the bare bulb. With grim determination, he held it up, tapped out the air bubbles, and found a vein in his own arm. He did not hesitate. He pushed the plunger home. Eleanor flinched, a sharp intake of breath, but she did not look away. Her eyes were locked on her husband's, a silent exchange of fear and unwavering support. Mary Ann recited a quiet prayer under her breath. Croft let out a shaky breath, and the room was filled with a blinding flash of light as he captured the moment on film. Vance had made himself a human test subject, violating every norm of medical ethics to create a theatrical, undeniable truth. Over the next several weeks, he and his small group of volunteers would repeat the process, swallowing pills made of dried skin flakes, having the filth swabbed into their noses and throats. They were subjecting themselves to the very essence of the disease to prove it had no power. Dr. Alistair Finch sat in his opulent Washington office, the picture of institutional power. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the fine leather of his chair and the rich wood of his desk. He held a copy of the Washington Herald, and for the first time in months, he was smiling. The smile was not one of joy, but of cold, predatory satisfaction. The headline was everything he could have hoped for, a masterpiece of sensationalism, mad doctor and human experiments. The article itself, written by Samuel Croft, was more nuanced. It carefully detailed Vance's hypothesis and the failures of the medical establishment to listen. But the facts of the experiments themselves, when laid bare for a public that knew nothing of nutritional science, were horrifying. The article spoke of inducing disease in helpless prisoners, of secret sessions where a doctor injected himself and his wife with the blood of the sick. It was the story of a man who had gone too far, a scientist playing God. Finch saw it perfectly. Vance, in his obsessive quest for proof, had handed him the ultimate weapon. He would no longer need to debate Vance on the science. He could simply destroy him with the law. He could paint him as a monster, a ghoul who tortured convicts and endangered his own family. The public, driven by fear and a superstitious horror of disease, would demand it. He carefully folded the newspaper and placed it on his desk. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of calm, righteous fury. He picked up the telephone receiver, his movements deliberate. "Get me the Attorney General," he said to his secretary, his voice calm and lethal. The war for the truth of Pellagra was about to enter its final, brutal stage. The atmosphere in the grand hall of the National Medical Conference was not one of scientific inquiry. It was the atmosphere of a public execution. A massive hostile crowd of the nation's most esteemed doctors filled every seat, their faces a sea of grim judgment. On the stage, Dr. Elias Vance looked small and utterly isolated at the podium. His adversary, Dr. Alistair Finch, had just concluded a masterful and damning speech, painting Vance as a reckless charlatan, a madman whose unholy experiments on the poor and on his own family made him a danger to the public and a disgrace to his profession. As if to punctuate the threat, 2 armed federal guards stood by the main doors, their presence a silent promise. They were not there to keep the peace. They were there to arrest Dr. Vance the moment he stepped down from the stage. The trap had been set. The verdict was all but delivered. Vance placed his hands on the podium to steady them. His voice, when he began to speak, was a low tremor, the vibration of a man pushed to his absolute limit. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "for the last year, I have been told that my evidence is anecdotal, that my observations are mere coincidence, that the truth of Pellagra lies with a phantom germ we have yet to find." He took a breath, and as he did, the tremor vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Today, I will not begin with data. Data, it seems, can be twisted." He nodded to a technician in the back of the hall. "Today, I will begin with photographs, a projector whirred to life, casting a bright square of light onto the screen behind him. The trial of Dr. Elias Vance was about to begin. The first image that appeared on the screen was a portrait of a man's face, gaunt and hollow-eyed, his mind clearly lost in a fog of dementia. His skin was a canvas of horror, marked by the dark, cracking lesions of advanced pellagra. Vance's voice cut through the silent hall. "This is prisoner Harris. 3 months ago." He clicked a button. A second photograph appeared beside the first. It was the same man. But the transformation was staggering. His eyes were clear, his face had filled out, and his skin was smooth and healthy. He was smiling. "And this," Vance said, his voice ringing with authority, "is prisoner Harris today, a free man with a full pardon." He advanced the slides. Image after image filled the screen, a powerful visual narrative of sickness and recovery. On one side of the screen, the men from his experimental group, ravaged by the disease he had inflicted upon them. On the other side, the same men from the control group, who had remained healthy and strong on a balanced diet. It was a story told in black and white, a story of 2 different menus, creating 2 drastically different fates. Then, he showed them the final photograph. It was a simple, clinical close-up of his own arm, taken just last week. The skin was clean, healthy, and completely uninfected. "For 6 weeks, Vance declared, his voice rising, "I, my wife, and a small group of volunteers have systematically injected and ingested the blood, skin, and filth of the sickest pellagra patients we could find. If there is a pellagra germ, it has had every opportunity to infect us, and yet we remain untouched." He turned off the projector, plunging the hall back into dim light. He stepped away from the podium and stood freely on the stage. "The germ you have been hunting is a phantom. The contagion you fear does not exist. The monster is not in the blood. It is in the diet. It is in the poverty we refuse to see." A wave of murmuring swept through the crowd, a sound of 1,000 rigid beliefs beginning to crack at once. The doctors were looking at each other, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning comprehension. In his seat, Dr. Alistair Finch was ashen, his face pale with fury. His narrative, his authority, his entire world had been dismantled in front of his peers in less than 10 minutes. An hour later, the storm had passed. The armed guards, their purpose rendered moot by the stunning reversal of opinion, were gone. Dr. Finch sat alone, an isolated figure in the emptying hall, his colleagues keeping a noticeable distance as if his dogma itself were now contagious. The center of gravity in the room had shifted. A crowd of doctors now surrounded Dr. Vance, not with hostility, but with the grudging respect and fervent curiosity of true scientists. They fired questions at him about the specific vitamin content, about the metabolic pathways, about the speed of recovery. The dogma was broken, and the exhilarating work of understanding could begin. In the midst of the crowd, Samuel Croft was scribbling furiously in his notepad, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. He had documented the fall and the rise, and he knew he had the story of a lifetime. And at the back of the room, standing quietly by the door, Mary Ann Pools simply watched. She didn't understand all the scientific jargon, but she understood what she was seeing. The tide had turned. The truth had won. The train station was a cacophony of steam, whistles, and hurried goodbyes. Dr. Vance, his briefcase holding not evidence but a simple change of clothes, was finally going home. Samuel Croft walked with him to the platform. Your name will be in every history book, Doctor, Croft said with genuine admiration. The man who solved the enigma of Pellagra. Vance stopped at the door of the passenger car. He looked past Croft, out at the grand buildings of the city, and then his mind's eye looked further, towards the impoverished, sun-baked lands he had just left. He had won. But the victory felt incomplete. "It's not about my name, Sam," he said, his voice quiet and weary. "The theory is accepted, the science is settled, but the poverty remains." He turned to face the journalist. The fight isn't over. He boarded the train without looking back. He was not a triumphant hero returning with a prize. He was a soldier, exhausted from one brutal battle, who knew with grim certainty that the larger war, the war against ignorance, against prejudice, against the poverty that was the true disease, had only just begun. On the surface, this is a classic story about the triumph of science over ignorance. Dr. Vance, armed with data and the scientific method, defeats the backward notion of a phantom germ. But the real, deeper conflict isn't just about the facts, it's about the kind of story we prefer to believe. Why was the idea of a mysterious plague, an invisible killer, so much more compelling to both the public and the establishment than the simple, ugly truth of malnutrition? I think it's because a monster, a germ, gives us a clear external enemy. It's something to be hunted and killed. It's terrifying, but it's also simple. The truth Vance uncovered was far more uncomfortable. It meant the monster wasn't some microscopic invader. It was us. It was a failure of the system, a disease of poverty that society itself had created and allowed to fester. That's a much harder villain to face. It forces us to look in the mirror, not through a microscope. It makes you wonder how often we still do this today, inventing simple monsters to avoid confronting the complex, uncomfortable problems we create ourselves. So, my question for you is, where in our modern world do you see us choosing a convenient superstition over an uncomfortable truth?